Soon, St. Vincent College will welcome the Pittsburgh Steelers onto campus as they report for head coach Mike McCarthy's first training camp with the franchise. A milestone moment for an organization that hasn't had to introduce a new head coach to its locker room in nearly 2 decades. The atmosphere in Latrobe figures to carry a different energy than in recent summers, not just because of the new voice in charge, but because of the broader sense that this Steelers team is entering a pivotal stretch with a roster that still has real questions to answer even after an aggressive offseason of roster building. Players will battle for starting roles and roster security throughout the month, and, as is the case every summer around the league, some will try to look good on tape for other teams monitoring their progress from afar, hoping a strong camp or preseason performance turns into an opportunity elsewhere if things don't break their way in Pittsburgh. Training camp has always doubled as an audition not just for a specific team's roster, but for the league as a whole, and personnel departments across the NFL will be paying close attention to how certain bubble players perform once the pads come on and the games start to matter, even if only in a preseason context. The Steelers will walk onto Chuck Noll Field with a number of questions still left to address, despite a busy free agency period and draft class aimed at shoring up some of the roster's more glaring weaknesses. General Manager Omar Khan won't just be watching closely from the sidelines during practices and scrimmages either. Given his track record of being active on the trade market in recent summers, there's a strong chance he might have a few teams on speed dial for potential deals as final roster cutdowns approach and other franchises around the league start to make difficult decisions about which of their own bubble players simply don't fit into their plans anymore. That's often when the best value emerges on the trade market. Not every roster spot around the NFL is secure once August rolls around, and plenty of teams find themselves with talented players who, for one reason or another, don't have a clear path to significant playing time on their current roster. Some of those situations resolve themselves through outright roster cuts, but many others get worked out through trades, since teams would rather recoup at least some value, even if it's just a late-round draft pick, rather than releasing a player for nothing and watching a division rival scoop him up for free. For the Steelers specifically, the team has several positions worth addressing beyond what's already on the roster. And while some rookies could stave off internal competition for a short time simply based on draft pedigree and coaching investment, once the preseason games actually begin, their on-field progress will really tell the story of whether they're ready to contribute right away or whether the front office needs to keep exploring outside options. A few bargain players who currently sit on other rosters around the league might end up on the trade block as camp progresses and roster crunches intensify. And it's worth keeping an eye on a handful of names who could realistically become available at a price point that makes sense for Pittsburgh's cap situation. Here are 4 such players the Steelers might realistically target as the summer unfolds. Walker Little, OT, Jacksonville Jaguars. With Broderick Jones' return timeline still unclear following the injury issues that have lingered around him, the Steelers may need to add legitimate depth at offensive tackle before the regular season gets underway. It's a position where the margin for error is thin, given how quickly an offensive line can unravel if injuries force backups into extended action without adequate reps or continuity alongside their new teammates. Walker Little has manned the left tackle spot for the Jacksonville Jaguars over the past several seasons, working his way into a starting role after being drafted out of Stanford, but he now faces a legitimate challenger for that job in Cole Van Lanen, a development that could shake up Jacksonville's offensive line plans heading into the year. Speculation around the league suggests the Jaguars are prepared to move on from Little given his substantial $14 million cap hit, a number that becomes harder to justify internally, especially since he currently looks like the underdog in the competition for the starting left tackle job. When a team is paying starter-level money to a player who's suddenly on the outside looking in for a starting role, that's typically when trade conversations start to heat up, since the alternative of paying a backup that kind of salary rarely makes long-term sense for a front office trying to build a competitive roster within the confines of the salary cap. Khan could realistically work out a deal involving a day 3 draft pick, a relatively low cost of entry for a player with little starting experience and physical tools, with Jacksonville potentially eating a portion of his cap hit, perhaps as much as half, in order to facilitate a trade and get something of value back rather than releasing him outright. For the Steelers, adding a player like Little would provide legitimate swing tackle insurance capable of stepping into a starting role if Jones' recovery timeline slips further, while also giving the coaching staff, and new offensive line coach James Campen in particular, another veteran option to work with as they continue evaluating the trenches throughout camp. Damar Hamlin, FS, Buffalo Bills. The Steelers already have their new head coach and a 7th-round draft pick enjoying something of a homecoming this year, so why not add another familiar face with local ties to the mix? Hamlin, the Pittsburgh area native and former Pitt standout whose remarkable recovery from cardiac arrest during a game in January of 2023 captured the attention of the entire country, would also address a potential organizational need at free safety, though realistically this kind of move would likely come later in training camp or during the preseason once roster situations around the league become clearer. The Steelers currently lack some of their younger talent at free safety, and the coaching staff has invested real developmental time into building depth at that position with an eye toward the future. But if camp or preseason performances end up changing that outlook in any meaningful way, whether due to injuries, inconsistency, or simply young players not developing as quickly as hoped, Hamlin could become an available and reasonably priced option worth pursuing, particularly given his familiarity with the region and the built-in emotional storyline that would come with a player of his profile returning home to play for the franchise he grew up rooting for. It wouldn't necessarily be a game-changing move in terms of pure talent acquisition, since Hamlin's role in Buffalo has generally been more about depth, special teams contributions, and locker room presence than being a true difference-maker on the back end of the defense. But it would bring in a credible veteran presence to shore up the safety position if needed, someone who understands what it takes to operate within a complex NFL defense and who could mentor some of Pittsburgh's younger defensive backs even in a part-time role. Given the goodwill and public relations upside that would come with such a move, it's easy to see why this kind of speculative pairing continues to generate buzz among fans and media alike, even if the on-field justification is more modest than some of Pittsburgh's other roster needs. Blake Fisher, OT, Houston Texans. Fisher has reportedly fallen out of favor with the Texans organization since being selected in the 2nd round of a recent draft, a disappointing development for a player who came into the league with real starting caliber expectations after a productive college career. If the Steelers end up being more concerned about depth at right tackle than they are about the left side of the offensive line, Fisher could be another logical candidate for Khan to call about his roster cuts approach, and Houston looks to move on from a player who no longer factors prominently into their plans. As a former 2nd-round pick, Fisher still carries the kind of draft pedigree that suggests untapped potential, and there's a reasonable argument that he could benefit from a fresh start with a new coaching staff and a different set of expectations than what he's dealt with in Houston. Sometimes talented young offensive linemen simply need a change of scenery, particularly if they were miscast in a scheme that didn't play to their strengths or if they got buried on a depth chart due to circumstances outside their control, such as injuries to other players or coaching staff turnover that disrupted their development path. The Steelers brought in longtime offensive line coach James Campen this offseason, a well-respected figure across the league known for his ability to develop and refine offensive line talent at every level of experience. Adding a player like Fisher into that kind of coaching environment could genuinely benefit both sides of a potential trade. Fisher would get the fresh start and renewed developmental attention he likely needs to salvage his early career trajectory, while the Steelers would get a young, athletically gifted depth piece at a position that currently represents something of a question mark on the roster, all without having to invest significant draft capital or cap space to acquire that kind of insurance. Drew Sanders, ILB, Denver Broncos. Malik Harrison currently carries a considerable cap hit for the Steelers while also sitting somewhat precariously on the roster bubble, a combination that tends to make front offices nervous heading into a new season, especially when better value might be available elsewhere on the trade market. If the Steelers want to pursue an upgrade at inside linebacker with more long-term upside than what Harrison currently offers, Sanders fits the bill about as well as any name currently being floated around the league. The athletic standout out of Arkansas, known for his blend of size, speed, and instincts at the second level of the defense, has largely been buried on a stacked Denver Broncos defensive depth chart since entering the league, unable to carve out the kind of significant role that his physical traits and college production once suggested he'd eventually claim. That's not an uncommon story for talented linebackers who land with a team that already has multiple established veterans ahead of them on the depth chart, and it often creates exactly the kind of buy low opportunity that a team like Pittsburgh, with a track record of successfully developing linebacker talent, would want to explore. Sanders offers legitimate scheme versatility that makes him particularly intriguing as a trade target. He can play the Mike linebacker spot in a traditional sense, reading and reacting to the run game while also handling coverage responsibilities over the middle of the field. But he has also cross-trained at edge at various points in his career, giving a defensive coordinator multiple ways to deploy him depending on matchup and situation. Beyond his defensive versatility, he has also carved out a meaningful role as a strong special teams contributor in Denver, the kind of value add that helps a player stick on an NFL roster even when he's not seeing extensive defensive snaps. And that kind of special teams reliability would translate seamlessly to whatever role the Steelers carved out for him initially. Given his age, draft pedigree, and remaining developmental upside, Sanders would likely cost more to acquire than some of the other names on this list, reflecting the fact that rival teams around the league are also aware of his talent level and would love to add a player with his profile if given the opportunity. The Steelers might need to offer a fourth-round pick to get a deal like this done, a more substantial price than what would be required for a rental-type player already on an expiring contract with more limited future value. Still, landing a player like Sanders for roughly half of what Harrison currently costs against the cap could make the move worthwhile in the long run, both from a financial flexibility standpoint and from a pure talent upgrade perspective, assuming the coaching staff believes they can unlock more of his potential than Denver's staff was able to over the past several seasons. Taken together, these four names represent the kind of value-based, opportunistic approach that has generally defined Khan's tenure as general manager, targeting players whose situations with their current teams have created buy low opportunities rather than pursuing high-priced, headline-grabbing additions that would require the Steelers to overextend themselves financially or in terms of draft capital. Whether any of these specific trades actually materialize will depend heavily on how training camp battles shake out across the league over the coming weeks, both in Pittsburgh and with the teams currently employing Little, Hamlin, Fisher, and Sanders. But as roster cut-down deadlines approach and teams are forced to make difficult decisions about who stays and who goes, it wouldn't be surprising to see Khan's phone start ringing, or ring out himself, in pursuit of one or more of these players as the Steelers look to fine-tune their roster before the regular season begins in earnest. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.